Hi, Colleen, can you hear me?
I can. Hello. Can you hear me? Nicole, can you hear me? Thank you, everyone. Glad you can hear us. We'll get started in just a couple minutes, letting a large group of people hop in. For those of you not familiar with Zoom, just know that this is a webinar format. And so your picture will not be on the screen. You should just be seeing the slide that says the 2021 mid-year form changes. Your microphones will also be turned off, and we'll be using the Q&A section as we go through the material. So as we have questions, please type those into the Q&A section. That'll allow us to make sure that everybody's questions get answered. Good morning to all of you that have been jumping on. Welcome to the 2021 Mid-Year Forms Changes webinar. We're about to get started. Just to clarify for everyone, this is webinar format, so your camera will be off as well as your microphone. If you have questions as we go through the material, we want you to feel confident in the material once we're done. So please type your questions into the Q&A section. That'll give everyone an opportunity to see answers as they come through, and we can talk through those questions. And we still have quite a few people pouring in, but in the interest of time and respecting all of you that got up bright and early and ready to learn and go through the new forms, why don't we go ahead and get started? Nicole, you want to get us started?
Thank you, Colleen. So real quickly, I want to thank everyone for attending this webinar regarding our form changes. We had a lot of requests come in asking us to do one of these webinars for our mid-year changes because there were some really large changes and some really important ones to the industry. We also have had a lot of recent news and announcements regarding some changes to how the Oregon real estate forms are delivered, and regarding the availability of software where the Oregon real estate forms are available. So I will be available at the end of this to answer some of those questions. But I want to make sure that we, in the interest of time, we focus on the webinar piece of this related to the form changes, and I'll field some of those questions towards the end of the webinar after we get through all of these form changes. But really quickly, I also want to introduce a few new things that we have on our website and available to our ORIF subscribers. We have a great new information center available at orifonline.com. This information center gives you excellent tools and resources, guides, and instructions on how to get the most out of your Oregon Real Estate Forms library. And then we have some great new options for our customer service. So we now have customer service. We're fully staffed with a dedicated team Monday through Friday, 8 to 6, Saturday and Sunday, 10 to 5. You can submit a request online at orifonline.com. You can also now chat live with our customer service team during our customer service hours. You can send an instant message through Facebook, call us, or email us. So there's lots of different options to get a hold of us, and we're staffed fully now so that we'll be ready and able to answer your call when you need us. And we want to thank Colleen, our Forms Committee Vice Chair for this year. She'll be our chair next year, for teaching this webinar for us. She is celebrating her 20th year as a realtor and her 15th year as a managing principal broker. She is truly invaluable on our Forms Committee, and we can't thank her enough for all that she's done in leading the committee through these changes and navigating the legal and industry changes throughout the year. So with that, I will transition it to Colleen.
Thank you so much, Nicole. So I will need you to tab through the slides for me. Yeah. And do you want to really quickly answer the question regarding CE for this class? I believe the content will take us about an hour. So we'll have a 1 hour credit hour for this class that is being offered through OREF. We'll also, as Nicole said, stay on the line to answer any additional questions, but the course topic itself for the form revision should take us until 10 o'clock.
Yes, and I will, and at the very last slide also has more information around the CE credits, but we will issue those. It takes us a few days, I say 7 to 10 days, but usually within a couple of days of the class being over, we'll issue those CE credits as long as when you registered, you included your Oregon real estate license number. If you did not include your license number or you registered under a different name, then we will send you an email address requesting that, or an email requesting that information so that we can prepare your certificate. So you'll have access to all of that. If you're registered as a group, we will reach out to you for your signed attendance sheets.
Perfect, thank you. All right, so, and thank you very much, Nicole, for the introduction. I appreciate your kind words. We have 3 new forms that we have introduced to your forms library. So we're going to start off by going over those 3 new forms. These are added to your toolkit. They're available for use if and when you and your client believe they're necessary. So the first new form that we have added is Form 097, the FHA Federal VA Amendatory Clause. As many brokers know, VA and FHA loans require that the sale agreement include a provision that the buyer has the right to terminate with a full refund of their earnest money if the property does not appraise at or above the purchase price. So historically, lenders have usually been the ones to introduce what we all know as the amendatory clause while we're in transaction. However, the Forms Committee received feedback from subscribers that some lenders are saying that this should actually be incorporated in with the offer itself, that this needs to be a term of the actual sale agreement. So your OREF Forms Committee added this form to your library. This is the amendatory clause for both FHA and VA financing. Which allows you to incorporate this in anytime a buyer is obtaining either of those 2 financing types. So the FHA and VA clauses that are on this form come straight from those loan requirements from HUD for FHA and from the VA from the Veterans Association for the VA clause. So this is the exact language that we would typically see on those forms that come from lenders. And so this one is now in your library as Form 097. The next form we have, there we go, is Form 099, Seller's Contingent Obligation to Sell. Now, where this form originated from the committee discussions and subscriber feedback was market conditions have really left us with low inventory. Sellers unwilling to put their house on the market out of concern that they wouldn't be able to find replacement property. Some of you may have seen remarks in the MLS system that says, make offer subject to seller finding suitable replacement property. And your buyer wants to submit an offer on that property. Finding the right language to protect your client in that situation can be challenging and leaves us trying to almost practice law by defining that contingency itself. It also leaves the question of when does the buyer get to know that they're purchasing the property? Does that contingency run all the way through closing, or is there a stop point? So this form was added as a tool in your toolbox to outline that contingency and to identify how that contingency affects timelines within the sale agreement. So within section 1, you'll see that we're actually defining the contingency where the seller is asking for a period of time after the offer has been signed and accepted to achieve one of the options listed there. And that can include entering into a purchase agreement for their replacement property, waiving or removing the inspection contingency for a replacement property, waiving or removing an appraisal contingency for replacement property, closing on the replacement property, or if the seller has some other trigger point that they want to identify that makes them comfortable removing this contingency and proceeding with the sale of their existing home, you can identify that on the line for other. Now, this contingency has a default of 5 business days, but as with most timelines in our forms, there is the blank line beforehand, so you have the option to define that length of time for this contingency. Let's go on to the next slide, section 2 of the form. This identifies the expiration of the sale contingency period. If the seller does not deliver written notice of termination before 5 p.m. on the last day of the contingency itself is deemed waived, and the seller is now obligated to proceed with the sale. So the responsibility for the contingency period falls exclusively on the seller. If the seller fails to terminate in writing before the contingency ends or negotiate an extension, the contingency is waived. Then all terms of the sale agreement commence. Section 3, earnest money. The seller must deliver if the seller terminates the sale due to the contingency, the buyer is entitled to a full refund of the earnest money. So again, if the seller exercises their right to terminate by 5 p.m. on the last day of the contingency, the buyer is entitled to their earnest money back. Section 4 addresses timelines in the sale agreement. So this form allows the buyer and seller to determine how timelines in the sale agreement will be handled. The first option has timelines on hold until the contingency has been waived or removed by the seller. So the buyer's inspection contingency, the deposit of earnest money, all of the timelines within the sale agreement would be set on hold. I apologize for I just saw the chat in there. That is my screensaver. So unless you want to, Nicole, turn off the video of you and I appearing on there, I can't control that while we're midway in the session. Didn't intend that to be an advertisement. I apologize. That is simply my Zoom screensaver. So back to timelines. The second option is the option the buyer and seller have to begin all timelines as defined within the sale agreement. However, if the seller were to terminate based on this contingency, this section goes on to state that the buyer can deliver evidence of payment for expenses for inspections and the loan process, and the seller will promptly reimburse the buyer for those expenses. So this has the buyer putting some skin in the game. They're starting their due diligence, but in the event that the seller actually terminates, the buyer would be compensated for the money they spent on their due diligence. Section 5 covers the buyer's right to terminate. This allows the buyer to terminate the sale by giving written notice to the seller anytime prior to the contingency being removed. So in this case, the buyer, because the seller is the one benefiting from the contingency, if the buyer is not willing to remain in contract during this time period, the buyer has the right to terminate the transaction. And if earnest money has been deposited, they would be entitled to that earnest money back. And the next slide, and I know there's probably questions on the new form. I will field those once we get through the entire form. And the next, can we get the next slide, Nicole? Thank you. All right. Oh, too far. Additional provisions, section 6. So additional provisions allows the parties to amend any of the pre-printed terms or add additional information. So if buyers and sellers have additional items that they want to add in here, that we certainly want to make sure you have the opportunity to do that. The form also includes, after the buyer and seller have signed lines 33 through 36, you'll notice that lines 40 through 44 are the actual notice that the seller is going to deliver to the buyer when they are removing the contingency or terminating the sale. Lines 46 through 48 are the lines the buyer would use to initiate termination while the contingency is still in place. So if the seller hasn't waived or removed the contingency and the buyer is electing to terminate, right here on the original form, those notices have been built in. So very important to note, as you're taking buyer and seller through this form, they do not sign every place that they see buyer and seller signature at the time of establishing agreement. From lines 40 through 48 are handled after the contingency has been established And the seller is either delivering notice to the buyer or the buyer is delivering notice to the seller. So Nicole, I don't know if you have Q&A up. Can you let me know what questions from those first two new forms that we've added that we might need to field?
Yes, so back to the first one. How does this differ from the lender form?
Is that the FHA VA amendatory clause? It doesn't differ at all. All that the forms committee has done is added that exact same form into your library so that you can initiate it with the contract. So it doesn't differ at all from the lender form. The lender, when they receive the offer, if this form is attached, there really will be no reason for their form to be sent out to all parties to sign.
Okay. And on the FHA one, again, should the form accompany the loan pre-approval letter when submitting an offer?
Actually, yes. When we get to revisions in the sale agreement, you'll see that a line has been added if we identify an FHA or a VA loan as the source of funds for the buyer. There is a notation that says that that amendatory clause will be added to the contract.
And on the FHA and VA forms, if the price changes within the transaction, would it be advisable to write up a new form and submit? In theory, could we have multiple FHA amendatory clause forms?
That's an excellent question. I would defer to the lender on that one. I don't see there being any risk of having additional forms as long as they're properly dated to show the sequence of forms. But I would check with the lender to see whether or not a revised amendatory clause is needed, since we do actually define the purchase price on that form. Excellent question, but I think we need to defer to the lender on whether or not amendment needs to be made.
And who submits ORF 99, buyer with an offer or seller with a counter?
Excellent question. It can be either. So a buyer may generate an offer after seeing the remarks saying that the seller is asking for this contingency, and the buyer can submit it with their offer, or they can prefer to put the burden on the seller to define what the contingency will be through a counter. It can be used by either party.
And if an offer was written and accepted before knowledge of ORF Form 97 was known, should this form be added after the fact if the sale has not closed escrow yet?
It is not a requirement to retroactively add Form 97. Chances are, if you have a VA or an FHA transaction going, the lender is going to get that form into play or reach out to you and ask you to deliver that form. Either way, it will need to be executed before closing. Just know that you have the form available if the lender turns to you asking for it.
Okay. And ORF 99, why should any of the contingencies of sale, EM2, title, etc., when the offer is now seller contingency, there's no official offer and therefore timeline should not begin until they are in contract?
And that's why there are two options on timelines. That's for the parties to define how they want to handle those. You may have a situation where a buyer is very eager to get the process going to ensure they close promptly. So suspending the timeline could delay closing. So it becomes negotiable between the parties. That's why those options are there.
Okay. And ORF 99, is this used when seller initially lists the property, or is this when they get an offer? If it is when they get an offer, does the seller send to buyer along with offer response, or does the seller's agent ask the buyer's agent to include when submitting an offer?
A buyer can submit whatever offer they choose to submit. So I don't know that a listing broker should necessarily be asking for this form to be incorporated. If it doesn't come from the buyer with their offer, the seller can certainly counter to add it in. This doesn't usually come up at the time of taking the listing. This would be something that's negotiated at the point of offer submission.
Does the seller return this form with an acceptance of buyer's offer? If so, and the buyer declines, do we have to sign termination forms?
So this would be a modification of the offer. And so the seller couldn't just accept the offer with this not included with the buyer's submission of the offer. That constitutes a counter. So we don't have mutual acceptance if the seller signed this and sent it with the acceptance of the offer. We essentially have a counter proposal. The buyer can then approve or disapprove, which defines whether or not we actually have a contract. So keep in mind, if the seller intends for this form to be incorporated into the contract and it wasn't submitted with the offer, the seller needs to counter in order to incorporate this in.
Okay. If a seller won't repay the buyer for out-of-pocket expenses like inspection and appraisal, is the only recourse to take them to small claims court?
Yes, if this will fall under the dispute resolution process in the sale agreement. So yes, just like any other provision in the contract, if the seller doesn't adhere to the terms, the buyer has a dispute resolution process at their disposal.
In item 4, section 2, promptly is somewhat vague. And in what form? Does this mean when a check is in the mail?
I am going to have to defer to either your principal broker or legal counsel. Promptly is actually a term used throughout our OREF forms. And I don't believe it has a definition within the contract itself. Promptly, I totally understand what you're saying, and it is subjective. I don't know that I can answer that. I'm not an attorney. I feel like I might be giving legal advice if I answer that question.
If the buyer is reimbursed, do we give the seller the report such as the appraisal?
No, there is no provision that requires delivery of reports, just the buyer providing evidence that they made those payments. So that does not change anything in the inspection contingency, which specifically states the buyer won't deliver reports unless specifically requested.
Okay, and so these two are kind of similar. When does the form enter in the transaction? Seller, counter, offer. If a buyer's agent delivers the offer, would the seller's contingent obligation be completed by the seller with the counter offer?
So it can be originated by either buyer or seller. I could see a potential for a scenario where you've already established mutual agreement on a contract, and this form gets introduced midway through the transaction. Doesn't mean the parties have to agree to it, but there really is no stipulation on when this form gets introduced. It's totally negotiable between the parties. So it can be initiated by the buyer with their offer, or it can be countered into the contract from the seller.
And will the lender use the FHA and VA or a form, or will we have to use their form too?
Our form is our OREF form is the same as theirs. It should satisfy. We have talked to several lenders through the course of doing our due diligence in developing the form, and it does meet the requirements for both FHA and VA. I can't speak to what an individual lender may possibly require.
All right, I'm going through a few of these. I want to make sure that we get some covered, but we may have to leave some till the end because we do have quite a few still left to go. So we'll go ahead and proceed, and then we'll go back to the one. So if you didn't get your question answered, sit tight. We'll answer them at the end, and then we also, if you have other additional questions that pop up, please post them in the questions and answers, and we'll get them answered for you.
And because we may be coming back to questions, when you type your question, please add the form number or the form name so that at the end, when we're going back, we can easily tell what form your question is related to. Awesome. Yes. And please know Nicole and I are committed to staying on as long as it takes to answer your questions. All right. Our next form, let's go ahead and tackle our next new form. This is form number 100, unrepresented party acknowledgement. So this form was created to help establish some risk reduction processes for licensees when the other side of a transaction has elected not to have representation in the transaction. So this form is designed to clarify the role that the broker has in the transaction when one party has elected not to have representation. So the first section covers representation, and it defines who it is that you as the agent are representing. Are you representing the buyer or the seller only in the transaction? This next section, no representation, clarifies that you are only representing the party you've identified in the representation section. You may be communicating with the unrepresented party. You may be drafting documents that the unrepresented party may sign, and you may be conducting activities to help facilitate the sale. But you're doing those activities solely for the benefit of your client. It doesn't make you an implied agent of the unrepresented party. The compensation section clarifies that compensation has absolutely nothing to do with representation. If the unrepresented party is in some way compensating you, that has absolutely no tie to whether or not you have representational duties to that unrepresented party. Agent duties clarifies that the only duties we have to the unrepresented party are to deal honestly and in good faith, to present all written offers, notices, and other communication from the parties in a timely manner, and to disclose material facts known by the agent and not apparent or ascertainable to a party. The agent has no other duties to the unrepresented party. Now, these are the first three duties that apply in both buyer representation, buyer agency, and seller agency in our initial agency pamphlet. These are the first three duties and responsibilities we have to all parties in the transaction. Confidentiality makes it clear to the unrepresented party that we have no obligation of confidentiality to the unrepresented party. So the unrepresented party should not be telling us confidential information because we have an obligation to provide that information to the client we actually represent. Due diligence section advises the unrepresented party that it is their responsibility to protect their interests, that they should be seeking advice from real estate, legal, tax, inspection, insurance, or other professionals as required for the advice they need in order to complete the sale. And the last point is the agency pamphlet. So the unrepresented party is acknowledging that they have received the initial agency pamphlet. So the unrepresented party will sign at the bottom of the form. I would recommend as a best practice that you're actually attaching the initial agency disclosure pamphlet along with this as you send it to the unrepresented party for signature. Any questions on this one, Nicole?
There we go. I have, how do you complete the top part of the purchase agreement where the names are entered in ORF 100?
Form 100, the property address. So this form could, when an offer is being submitted with an unrepresented party, you would simply be identifying the property address and the agent name, and then the unrepresented party is signing at the bottom.
Okay, and please give examples of material facts.
So because that's not really part of the form revision or the form launch. I don't want to go too deep into that conversation. It really comes down to agency law and our duties under the Realtor Code of Ethics. But we have an obligation to disclose material information about the property or about the transaction. And I believe there may have been a question about readily ascertainable. That would be if somebody couldn't visually see something for themselves, they would have had to do something invasive, go into the attic to see an issue. It's readily ascertainable, meaning you can see it as you're walking through the property.
That's all. Oh.
All right, so those were
can you display the actual, can you display the actual Form 100? A preview of all of the forms and these form changes are also available at orifonline.com. If you click on the Forms tab and Form Update, you can see the full redline versions of these or the full versions of the forms. You can also download the presentation material and the form changes guide.
Awesome. And I believe the recording is going to be available as well. Is that correct?
Correct.
Yes. Excellent. All right. So let's go on to the next slide. And the next slide covers the 5 forms that have had content updates to them. So we're just going to briefly go through the forms that have had specific content changes, starting with the Residential Real Estate Sale Agreement Form 001. Because of the VA and FHA amendatory clause, which just so that you're aware, the language in those loan programs stipulates that the sale agreement must contain a provision stating the borrower has the option to terminate the sale agreement and receive a prompt refund of all earnest money paid if the appraised value of the property is less than the purchase price. So because the loan program actually stipulates that that is a part of the sale agreement, we've amended your financing contingency. So this would be Section 4, Item B of the sale agreement, where you're identifying the type of loan program. If FHA or VA are selected, a line was added to clarify that Form 097, the FHA Federal VA amendatory clause, is attached. So buyer's agents, as you're drafting your offer, it is highly recommended you incorporate that form at the time of submitting your offer. The next change we have on the sale agreement is in regards to seller property disclosure statement. So early in 2021, there was a lot of discussion across the entire state regarding the inconsistency of the language within the statute itself for seller property disclosure law and the day-to-day practices that brokers have across the state in terms of when the buyer's 5-day right to revoke actually begins. It is confusing if you were to read statute itself, because it says that the seller is obligated to provide the form to any buyer who submits a written offer to purchase. It actually doesn't define that there needs to be a mutually accepted contract in order for that delivery to happen, just any offer being submitted. Then the clarification needed to be made because in one part of the statute, it references 5 business days. In another part of the statute, it just says 5 days. So in an effort to clarify the confusion that had been created across the state, the Forms Committee elected to modify Section 13 of the sale agreement. Now, keep in mind, as much as we would love to make changes to the seller property disclosure statement itself, it is a statutory form. So we can't make substantial changes to that form. It needs to be handled through the legislature. So this is where you talk to your representatives about getting this statute modified. What we can do is create some clarity in the contract between buyer and seller, which is what we've done in Section 13. In order to clarify when the buyer's 5-day right to revoke their offer actually begins, we've defined in the sale agreement that two things need to happen. The offer needs to be signed and accepted by both buyer and seller. Now, signed and accepted is a defined term within the contract, meaning that the receiving party of the offer has accepted it and delivered a copy back to the offering party. The second point that needs to happen is that the seller has delivered to the buyer or buyer's agent a complete seller property disclosure statement. So until both of those things have occurred, the 5-day revocation period does not begin. Once they have both occurred, the 5 business day right to revoke begins. So if you can go to the next slide, I know that there are always questions about the completeness of a seller property disclosure statement. And so we want to tackle and provide some clarity on what does complete really mean, because I know all of us have probably experienced receiving a seller property disclosure statement with not all the questions answered or without the attached explanations that are required. So there is no definition in statute of the word complete, but other statute and case law provides some help. So if we look at the very first sentence on the seller property disclosure statement, that statutory form, it says, please complete the following form. Do not leave any spaces blank. Please refer to line numbers or the questions when you provide your explanations. If you are not claiming an exclusion or refusing to provide the form under statute, you should date and sign each page of this disclosure and each attachment. So right there is the definition really that we should be working on, which is every line is answered. Attachments are signed by the seller. Now, it also states that disclosures contained in this form are provided by the seller on the basis of the seller's actual knowledge of the property at the time of disclosure. So this should accurately reflect what the seller knows about the property at the time they are delivering the disclosure to the buyer. And then case law indicates that all parties to contracts in Oregon have an obligation to act in good faith and fair dealings. And so in order to recognize that this is a delivered complete document, you can't intentionally try to withhold information. And a buyer who receives an incomplete disclosure really should be promptly notifying the listing broker or seller that the document is incomplete. I highly recommend doing this in writing so that you have a written record of notifying. For a buyer who elects to not bring it to the seller's attention that they deem the disclosure statement incomplete, if that buyer thinks they're retaining their 5-day right to revoke all the way until closing, that could become an issue with the good faith and fair dealings in case law. A buyer intentionally not notifying the seller that they deem the disclosure incomplete doesn't automatically translate into an automatic right to revoke all the way till closing. All right, let's go on to the next question, and then I'll tackle any questions about the sale agreement changes. We have a couple of rather minor changes, but just to make you aware, section 17, we edited only to reflect the correct name of the form. Homeowners Association Townhome Planned Community Addendum was renamed in January. We missed one spot where we needed to make that correction. That's been done. Section 36.2 was adjusted to reflect the correct number for the historic property addendum. So there's a section within the sale agreement 36.2 that says if the property is or could be deemed historic, the seller is to attach, and it named the specific form. We just needed to correct the form number by adding the letter A to it. That's the only change there. Section 39.2 was adjusted to better reflect the mediation and arbitration process as defined by NAR. So are there specific questions in the Q&A about the residential sale agreement? Nicole?
Yes, sorry, it'd be help if I was not on mute. The SPD section 13, if SPD is included in MLS listing documents, does that count as having provided the buyer?
Well, delivery, if you're asking if you upload the disclosures to the MLS and tell a buyer's agent to go get it, from everything that I have heard from real estate attorneys, that is not delivery. And the burden is on the seller to deliver to the buyer's agent.
Okay. Does the start of the 5-day business period start the day everyone has received offer acceptance or the next business day?
As with all timelines as defined in the sale agreement, it would start the next business day.
Okay. If a seller agent delivers the disclosures after accepted offer and buyer signs and returns within 5 days, is the buyer accepting them and they have accepted, or are they just acknowledging them and they still have 5 days to exercise the revocation of the offer? That has always been confusion.
Yeah, they are only acknowledging receipt. There is nothing in that paragraph at the end of the disclosure statement that says by signing, the buyer is waiving their right to revoke. So the right to revoke remains intact for the full 5 business days, unless the buyer specifically waives that right in writing. And there's a whole separate document in your forms library specifically for that.
If a VA FHA buyer is offering appraisal protection, won't that conflict with the added amendatory clause?
So yes, I think that's part of the reason the form ended up getting incorporated into your forms library was market conditions has buyers and sellers offering to cover the appraisal gap, which is great. You certainly can do that on an FHA or a VA loan, but what is important is that the buyer, if they elect to terminate because the property doesn't appraise, they can't lose their earnest money.
And then we do have a few others that are a little more lengthy. So if we want to tackle those at the end, okay, I will work on putting those in queue.
All right, let's move on to our next form that's had changes. This form was called your wire fraud advisory. It is now renamed to be the electronic funds advisory. So according to the FBI, there were in 2020, 13,638 people who became victim of electronic funds transfer fraud, with losses over $213 million. So this remains still a very solid risk for both buyers and sellers in transactions. What the Forms Committee has done here is amended the wire fraud to make it electronic funds advisory, because there are so many other ways for funds to be transferred other than just a wire. And so we wanted to make the form all-inclusive, warning our buyers and sellers that fraud exists in any of the electronic transfer scenarios. So the form starts out with how fraud occurs, a brief statement about how the criminals are trying to steal your money. And then if we can go to the next slide, the form goes on to explain to the client how they can protect themselves and prevent fraud. And then the final section is how to report fraud. So there are links directly to the FBI and the Oregon Department of Justice. So if they become victim of fraud or they think a fraud attempt was made, this is where they can go to make those reports. So the form is, some of you may have been looking for the wire fraud notice, still exists in your forms library. It is now just the electronic funds advisory. And the next form we have changes to is the wood stove, Form 46, the wood stove fireplace insert addendum. So just some cleanup on this form that took place. It really hadn't been amended much since it launched in 2010. So to start, we removed the reference that this law became effective in 2010. We've cleaned up some redundant statements referencing the statute and clarified that the responsibility for the removal of the uncertified wood stove isn't necessarily solely a seller responsibility, since the law does allow a provision for the buyer to accept that responsibility up to 30 days after the close of the transaction. Section 2, regarding the certification label, we've simply updated the website location where the EPA maintains a list of certified wood stoves. On the next slide, we'll go to Section 3, exemptions. We've added cook stoves, factory-built fireplaces, and saunas, and defined antique as pre-1940 to match the statute. Section 4, this section was updated to reflect changes in the DEQ process. So the form used to state that there was a form you could download on the DEQ website and submit. It's all handled electronically now, so the reporting is completed online, no longer in person. I'm sorry, no longer on paper. Section 5 clarifies who's responsible for the removal. If the buyer is accepting responsibility for the removal and destruction, it clarified the language in Section 5 to make it clear the buyer should not be automatically initialing that line. It states now, if buyer initials below, that responsibility will shift from seller to buyer. And then Section 6, there's a reference to the Oregon administrative rules. So we have statute, but then there are also administrative rules that help clarify the regulations regarding the removal and destruction of uncertified wood stoves and wood burning inserts. So adding the reference to the administrative rules so that clients can get additional information. And then the last form that we have had a change to is Form 054, Agreement to Occupy After Closing. The only change that was made here, Agreement to Occupy After Closing, yes. The change here had to do with the insurance provision, Section 13. So we've received, the Forms Committee has received a lot of feedback from subscribers and insurance brokers regarding the default $1 million amount for liability insurance that the seller would need to obtain. So from that feedback, research that we've done regarding availability of $1 million liability insurance policies, the committee elected to change that default to $500,000, but still very much with the blank line so that the parties can negotiate any amount they feel comfortable with regarding liability insurance. We've also clarified that the buyer is securing this policy before closing. I'm sorry, yeah. Buyer will secure their policy before closing, and the seller will deliver evidence of their coverage at least 5 business days before the close date. So this is clearly defined now in the agreement between buyer and seller, rather than just saying before closing, at least 5 business days before closing. Smoke alarm and carbon monoxide advisory. This form, you may have noticed, was removed from your forms library earlier in the year. It needed to be totally restructured based on feedback from the state fire marshal. We've done a lot of work to make this advisory a resource and to make it very clear that real estate licensees are not experts regarding smoke and carbon monoxide alarms. We are talking about it with our clients to raise awareness, but not to be the end-all be-all resource for them regarding these units. And if we go to the next slide, you'll see that we've added a whole list of resources for buyers and sellers to go to regarding their requirements, and the option for you to add additional local resources specific to where the property is located for your buyers or sellers to get additional information. So this form is a reintroduction back into your forms library. And then the next slide, I'm gonna breeze through these next ones because they're fairly short, and then we'll tackle questions. So we have technical changes on 7 forms. The first one is on 035, seller carried promissory note secured by a deed and trust. This form is used if buyer and seller are entering into an agreement for owner financing. So the seller is going to carry the debt on the property. Throughout the form, the language referencing the parties has been maker and holder, but for some reason, section 14 was referencing buyer and seller. So to create continuity in the form, we've replaced that language with maker and holder throughout section 14, so it now matches the rest of the form. Next up, we have disclosed limited agency agreement for sellers. So we disclosed limited agency agreement is defined by statute. And what we have found in feedback from subscribers is that having the conversation with both buyers and sellers regarding disclosed limited agency was challenging when the form lumped together all of the situations where disclosed limited agency may occur and has the client consenting to all of those situations when in fact they may not be willing to accept all of those situations. So the very first thing we did on line 18 of, this is the seller's form, on line 18, we have the buyer acknowledging that they received the initial agency disclosure pamphlet. And then as we go into section 2, we're actually asking the seller whether or not we have their permission to represent one or more buyer in a transaction involving the listed property. That's specific to you, the listing broker, because item B goes on to specify that the seller is consenting to the principal broker of the firm acting as a disclosed limited agent if an offer comes in from another broker in the same office. So we are simply discussing on item A whether or not the seller is authorizing the listing broker to also represent a buyer in the sale of that property. This can be the seller who's dictating this. This could also be you as the broker. If it is your business practice that you choose not to represent both sides, you may automatically elect to mark may not and explain to your client why you are making that choice. The next form we have is the disclosed limited agency for buyers. So you'll see we've added the same initials for the buyer acknowledging receipt of the initial agency disclosure pamphlet. On the buyer agency, we have 2 scenarios where disclosed limited agency might occur with the individual broker representing the buyer. The first one, the buyer is electing whether or not the buyer's agent may also represent the seller in any transaction involving the buyer. So that would be you as the broker representing both buyer and seller. The second option is asking, does the buyer authorize you as the buyer's agent to represent more than one buyer in making offers on the same property as the buyer? Now, statute allows this. So the question is, does your buyer authorize you to do that? And again, this can be defined by you or the buyer depending on your business practices. Item C remains just like on the seller form. The principal broker may still act as a disclosed limited agent if the property is listed by another broker in the same office. All right, next form we have historic property addendum. We added some clarifying language. A new sentence was added to make it clear the purpose of the addendum. So the form now starts with, use this addendum if the property is or may be subject to a historic property local ordinance, or is subject to or may qualify for the historic property special property tax assessment under statute. So that new line was added at the opening of the document to clarify when it should be used. Form 53, agreement to occupy before closing. Small change made to this document. So clarifying in the occupancy section, if the buyer is going to occupy the property before closing and before they own it, subscriber pointed out that there was no reference anywhere in this document regarding the transfer of keys. So we added a line in the occupancy section saying that the seller shall deliver one full set of keys at the beginning of the described section. So a minimum of at least one set of keys delivered to the buyer during that occupancy period. The next form we have is the Form 061, Buyer Advisory regarding the purchase of bank-owned property. We deleted the language that says, however, the best protection you can have is to obtain a standard owner's policy of title insurance. We've replaced that with a prudent choice is to obtain the owner's policy of title insurance. Is it the best? Gosh, not sure, and I'm not sure that we want our forms representing that it is the best choice. So just clarifying that it is a prudent choice. And our next form is Form 083, Buyer's Contingent Right to Purchase. So a couple of changes were made throughout the form to incorporate plain English. The committee's working hard to try to eliminate a lot of the legalese that we see, the legal language throughout the form, and make sure that buyer and seller can understand the intent of the document in plain English. So you'll see that instead of saying whichever, which it used to say, first occurs, and now it's changed to occurs first. So small change in section 2. Section 6, we've removed lines 7 and 8, which addressed whether or not the buyer could accept a contingent offer on their existing property, because this was a duplication of language. That language still exists in section 1 of the form, all the way at the top, up at the beginning. It is important information. We just didn't feel it needed to be a redundant statement made also in section 6. So those are the changes to the forms. I think we have one last slide and then we can dive into questions. There we go. So this wraps up. Nicole, I'll let you make any last updates, but this would end the regular content of the class. So if you got all of your questions answered and you don't want to hang out for Q&A, just know we've gone through all of the material. For those of you with questions, Nicole and I are here to answer them.
Yes, thank you. And again, I'll leave this slide up. Allow us 7 to 10 days to issue the certificates. Again, we'll try to get those out in the next couple of days. You will receive a certificate by email. And we now have a feature where you can view any of your customer service contacts or requests, and that includes receiving your CE certificates. So on our subscriber support page, you'll be able to click on a link there, and it will ask you to log in, and you'll be able to see all of your CE certificates that we've issued since September and anything that you've reached out to us from customer service as well. So the video will be available for replay at orifonline.com on our training page. And again, you can reach us at customer service at orifonline.com if you have any other questions.
And I will just add in, hopefully as we went through these changes, you saw that the Forms Committee really does listen to the feedback of subscribers. You have a voice in the Forms library at your disposal, in your toolkit. So if you have recommendations for changes to forms, new forms you'd like to see added to the library, please make sure that you're submitting those requests to customer service at orefonline.com. Those go straight to the committee, and we want to make sure that we're serving you at the highest possible level.
Yes, in fact, you'll see a couple of the questions that were suggestions. I replied that we would forward those to the Forms Committee. As Colleen said, they go immediately to the Forms Committee. The Forms Committee then decides how to address it and in context with the other changes and suggestions that they're addressing. So you may not always see that change happen with the next set of changes that come out in the forms, but it doesn't mean that you won't see that change happen. Absolutely, your comments, suggestions, and feedback drive the changes in these forms.